At 9:43 a.m. on December 15, 1943, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington watched 32 wounded Marines lying in the mud at Torokina airstrip on Bougainville, listening to Japanese artillery shells walk closer with each salvo. 31 years old, 25 confirmed kills, 0 experience landing a fighter aircraft loaded with wounded men. The Japanese had launched a major counteroffensive 48 hours earlier, 3,000 troops pushing toward the Allied perimeter. Artillery, 0D on the airstrip. Every transport aircraft had been evacuated south to Guadalcanal. The wounded couldn't walk, they couldn't wait. And in 20 minutes, the next artillery barrage would hit the strip directly. Standard doctrine said fighter pilots don't evacuate casualties. Training said the Vought F4U Corsair wasn't designed for passenger transport. Common sense said attempting it would get everyone killed. Boyington had different priorities. In the next 37 minutes, he would convert a single-seat fighter into an improvised ambulance, develop a loading technique that violated every safety regulation the Marine Corps had written, and proved that sometimes the difference between 32 men living or dying comes down to one pilot who refuses to follow the manual. This is the story of how Pappy Boyington turned the Corsair into a rescue aircraft, how innovation under fire saved an entire platoon, and how one impossible landing changed Marine Corps evacuation doctrine for every jungle campaign that followed. Gregory Boyington grew up in Tacoma, Washington, where his stepfather ran a logging operation. By 14, Boyington was working the lumber camps during summer, falling trees, hauling logs, operating equipment that could kill a man if he made one mistake. The logging camps taught him 2 things. First, when something goes wrong, you fix it immediately because hesitation gets people hurt. Second, the equipment manual tells you what something's designed to do, not what it can actually do under pressure. At 22, Boyington joined the Marine Corps Reserve. He wanted to fly. The Marines sent him to Pensacola for flight training in 1935. He washed out twice, not because of flying ability, because of discipline. Boyington broke regulations constantly, buzzing control towers, unauthorized aerobatics, ignoring altitude restrictions. His instructors said he flew like he was trying to prove something. Boyington said he was trying to find out what the aircraft could actually handle. He finally earned his wings in 1937. The Marines assigned him to VMF 214, a fighter squadron based at San Diego. He flew Boeing F-4B biplanes, then Grumman F-3F fighters. Solid aircraft, but limited. Boyington kept pushing them beyond their rated performance envelopes. He wanted to know their actual limits, not their paper specification. In 1941, Boyington resigned his Marine commission and joined the American volunteer group in China, the Flying Tigers. He flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese aircraft over Burma and southern China. The AVG had no regulations, no manual restrictions. Pilots flew however they needed to fly to stay alive and kill the enemy. Boyington thrived. He destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft during his AVG service, but the Flying Tigers disbanded in July 1942. Boyington returned to the United States and rejoined the Marine Corps as a major. They needed experienced combat pilots. Boyington had that. They assigned him to command VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, in September 1943. The squadron flew F4U Corsairs. The Corsair was the best fighter aircraft the Marines had. Chance Vaught designed it around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. 2,000 horsepower, the most powerful piston engine in any production fighter. That power gave the Corsair incredible performance. Top speed 417 miles per hour. Climb rate 3,120 feet per minute. Service ceiling 36,900 feet. 650 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings. The Corsair could outrun, outclimb, and outgun almost every Japanese fighter in the Pacific. But it had problems. The long nose blocked forward visibility during takeoff and landing. The landing gear was tall and narrow, making ground handling difficult. The engine torque was so extreme that it could flip the aircraft on takeoff, if the pilot wasn't careful. Navy carrier pilots struggled with the Corsair. They called it the Ensign Eliminator. Too dangerous for carrier operations. The Navy restricted Corsair deployment to land-based Marine squadrons, where the long runways provided more margin for error. Boyington loved the Corsair. He understood its quirks. The visibility problem meant you had to S-turn on the ground to see ahead. The torque meant you had to anticipate rudder correction before opening the throttle. The narrow landing gear meant you had to land perfectly centered or ground loop. None of that bothered Boyington. He'd been flying difficult aircraft his entire career. The Corsair's performance more than compensated for its handling challenges.
VMF 214 deployed to the Solomon Islands in September 1943.
They operated from Guadalcanal initially, then forward deployed to Munda on New Georgia, then to Vella La Vella. The squadron's mission was air superiority over Bougainville and Rabaul. Shoot down Japanese fighters. Protect American bombers, clear the skies so ground forces could advance. Boyington flew 2 to 3 combat missions per day. He shot down Japanese aircraft with mechanical efficiency. His tactics were simple: get close, shoot straight, don't waste ammunition. By December 1943, Boyington had 25 confirmed kills. He was tied with Captain Joe Foss for the Marine Corps record. Every aviation journalist in the Pacific wanted to interview him. Every squadron wanted tactics briefings. Boyington ignored the attention. He focused on keeping his pilots alive and killing Japanese aircraft. If you want to see how Boyington's unconventional approach saved 32 Marines, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Boyington. On December 13th, 1943, Japanese forces launched a major counteroffensive against the Allied perimeter on Bougainville. 3,000 troops, supported by artillery and airstrikes. The attack hit the Marine positions around Torokina airstrip. Torokina was the primary Allied airfield on Bougainville. Captured in November 1943, expanded to handle fighters and light bombers. The strip was 3,800 feet of packed coral and dirt. Not long enough for heavy bombers, adequate for Corsairs and transport aircraft. The Japanese counteroffensive was designed to recapture Torokina and push Allied forces back to the coast. If they succeeded, the entire Bougainville campaign would collapse. Marine ground forces held their positions, but casualties mounted quickly. By December 14th, the field hospital at Torokina had 47 wounded Marines. Most were ambulatory. They could walk to transport aircraft for evacuation. But 14 were litter cases. Couldn't walk, couldn't sit up, needed immediate medical evacuation to rear area hospitals. The Army Air Force ran regular C-47 transport flights from Torokina to Guadalcanal, 2 flights per day, morning and afternoon. The C-47 could carry 18 litter patients plus medical attendants. Evacuating 14 wounded meant 1 flight. No problem under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. On December 14th at 14:20 hours, Japanese artillery. Observers spotted the afternoon C-47 landing at Torokina. They called in fire. 6 1-series 5mm artillery pieces opened up. Shells landed 200 yards from the parked transport. The C-47 crew aborted loading and took off immediately. No casualties evacuated. Japanese artillery continued hitting the airstrip through the night. Shells landed randomly across the strip and taxiways. The Japanese gunners couldn't see the airstrip directly. They were firing from positions 8 miles north, using spotters with radios, but their fire was accurate enough to make the strip dangerous. Any aircraft on the ground for more than 3 minutes risked getting hit. By morning of December 15th, Torokina had 32 wounded Marines requiring evacuation. The original 14 litter cases plus 18 more from the previous night's fighting. The field hospital had no capacity for serious cases. They could stabilize wounds, provide morphine, replace blood loss with plasma, but they couldn't perform surgery. Wounded Marines with internal injuries or severe trauma needed to get to a real hospital within 24 hours or they would die. The morning C-47 flight approached Torokina at 0830. Japanese artillery opened fire when the aircraft was 5 miles out. The C-47 pilot saw shell bursts across the runway and diverted to Vella La Vella without landing. At 09, the Torokina base commander radioed Guadalcanal. Request emergency evacuation capability. We have 32 litter cases. Cannot hold longer than 24 hours. Advise. Guadalcanal responded at 09:15. No transport aircraft available for high-risk evacuation until weather improves. Estimate 48 hours. The base commander knew 48 hours meant dead Marines. Some of the wounded wouldn't survive another day. He called together his staff officers. Medical officer, operations officer, air liaison officer. They needed options. The medical officer said they could stabilize another 12 hours, maybe 18. After that, the most seriously wounded would start dying. Internal bleeding, infection, shock. The operations officer said no transport pilot would risk landing under active artillery fire. It violated theater aviation safety regulations. Pilots could refuse dangerous missions and face no consequences. The air liaison officer mentioned one possibility. VMF 214 was operating from Vella La Vella, 40 miles south. Their Corsairs flew combat air patrol over Bougainville daily. Maybe a fighter pilot would volunteer. The base commander asked if Corsairs could carry wounded. The air liaison officer said no, single-seat fighter, no passenger capacity. Not designed for it. But Boyington had a reputation for doing things aircraft weren't designed to do. The base commander sent a radio message at 09:25 to VMF 214, Vella La Vella. Request volunteer pilot for emergency wounded evacuation. Torokina under artillery fire. Transport aircraft cannot land. Need immediate solution. Boyington was in the VMF 214 ready room when the message arrived. He'd just returned from a morning combat patrol. 3 Corsairs, 90-minute sweep over Rabaul. No contact with enemy aircraft. He read the message twice. Emergency evacuation. Torokina under fire. No transports available. His first thought was they were asking him to coordinate fighter cover for a C-47. That made sense. Corsairs could suppress Japanese artillery observers. Maybe give a transport enough time to land and load wounded. But the message said volunteer pilot for evacuation. Not fighter cover, evacuation. That meant flying the wounded himself. Boyington walked to the operations tent and asked the radio man to clarify the request. The response came back in 4 minutes. Need fighter pilot to land at Torokina. Load wounded. Evacuate to Guadalcanal. Transport capacity unavailable. Your discretion. Fighter pilot. Load wounded. In a Corsair? Boyington looked at the specifications board on the ops tent wall. 4U Corsair. Length 33 feet. Wingspan 31 feet. Single cockpit. No passenger space. No cargo capacity. The aircraft was designed to carry 1 pilot, 6 machine guns and ammunition, nothing else. But Boyington had been pushing aircraft beyond design specifications his entire career. He asked the operations officer a simple question. How much does a wounded Marine weigh? The operations officer didn't know. Boyington estimated. Average Marine, 170 pounds. Combat gear, 30 pounds. 200 pounds total. A wounded Marine without gear, maybe 170 pounds. The Corsair's empty weight was 8,982 pounds, fully fueled with ammunition. Combat weight was 12,039 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight was 14,000 pounds. That gave a theoretical margin of 1,961 pounds. 11 wounded Marines at 170 pounds each equaled 1,870 pounds. The math worked, theoretically. But that assumed he could actually fit 11 men into a Corsair designed for 1. The cockpit was 38 inches wide. A man's shoulders were 18 inches. 2 men couldn't fit side by side, but they could fit front to back, sitting one behind the other, or lying down. The Corsair's fuselage behind the cockpit was 14 feet long before the tail section started, Empty space. Just structure and control cables. If you remove the seat armor and radios from the aft fuselage, that space could hold wounded men. Maybe. Boyington walked to the flight line where his Corsair was parked. Bureau number 17915, sign number 86. He'd flown this aircraft for 4 months. He knew every panel, every access point, every structural limitation. He opened the aft fuselage access panel and looked inside. The space was 3 feet wide, 2 feet high, 8 feet long before the empennage structure began. Tight, but possible. A wounded Marine lying flat could fit, maybe 2 lying head to toe. Boyington called his crew. Chief, Technical Sergeant Frank Walton. Walton had been maintaining F4U since they entered service. He knew the aircraft as well as any engineer at Chance Vought. Boyington explained the situation. Wounded Marines at Torokina, no transport available. Need to evacuate using the Corsair. Can we modify the fuselage to carry passengers? Walton stared at him for 5 seconds. That's insane, sir. Can we do it? Regulations say no. I didn't ask about regulations. I asked if we can do it. Walton looked at the open fuselage panel. We'd need to remove the AFT radio equipment. That's 60 pounds. Remove the auxiliary fuel tank. That's 40 pounds empty. We could create maybe 80 cubic feet of space. Enough for 2 men lying down. How long to modify? 30 minutes, if we don't worry about putting it back together properly. Boyington checked his watch. 0940. If he left by 10:15, he could reach Torokina by 10:45. Load wounded. Depart by 11 before the next artillery barrage. Do it. I'll brief the squadron on fighter cover. Walton grabbed 2 mechanics and started pulling panels off the Corsair's aft fuselage. They worked fast. Removing radio equipment meant disconnecting cables and unbolting racks. The auxiliary fuel tank was held by 4 bolts and 2 fuel lines. They pulled everything in 22 minutes. By 10:05, Boyington's Corsair had 80 cubic feet of empty space in the aft fuselage. Not comfortable, not safe, but possible. The next problem was how to actually load wounded men into that space. The fuselage access panel was 18 inches wide. A man's shoulders were 18 inches. Tight fit. Wounded men couldn't climb in themselves. They'd need to be lifted and slid in feet first. Boyington calculated loading time. 2 men per fuselage. Loading time maybe 4 minutes per man. 8 minutes per aircraft. He'd need multiple trips. 32 wounded meant 16 trips at 2 men each. 16 landing under artillery fire. 16 takeoffs from a 3,800-foot coral strip. The math didn't work. He'd get hit before completing half the evacuation. He needed a different approach. Maximum loading per aircraft. How many wounded could one Corsair actually carry? 2 in the aft fuselage. What about the cockpit? The pilot's seat was wide enough for 1 man. What if a wounded Marine sat on the pilot's lap, or in front of the pilot between the seat and the instrument panel? Boyington tested the cockpit space. He sat in the pilot's seat. Called over a mechanic, Corporal James Reed, 5'9", 160 pounds. Average size. Reed, sit in my lap. Reed looked confused but complied. He sat sideways on Boyington's lap. His legs extended to the right rudder pedal. His shoulders blocked Boyington's view of the instruments. Boyington shifted Reed forward. Reed's back pressed against the control stick. That wouldn't work. Face forward. Sit between my legs. Reed repositioned. He sat facing forward, his back against Boyington's chest, his legs extending down both sides of the control column. Boyington could see over Reed's right shoulder. He could reach the throttle and mixture controls on the left side. He could operate the rudder pedals. He couldn't see the instrument panel, but he could fly by outside visual reference. It would work, for short flights in good weather. Boyington did the math again. 2 wounded in the aft fuselage. 1 wounded sitting forward in the cockpit. 3 men per trip. 32 wounded men, 11 trips. Still too many, unless other pilots volunteered. Boyington walked back to the ready room. His squadron executive officer, Captain George Ashman, was briefing the morning flight schedule. Boyington interrupted. I need volunteers for a non-standard mission. Evacuating wounded from Torokina Aircraft modification required. Multiple landings under artillery fire. Anyone interested? The ready room went silent. 18 pilots stared at him. Captain Frank Walton asked, "What's the modification?" Boyington explained. "Remove aft fuselage equipment. Load wounded men into the empty space. 1 in the cockpit with the pilot. 2 in the fuselage. 3 per aircraft." "That's not in the manual, sir," Walton said. "The manual doesn't cover this situation." Lieutenant Robert McClurg raised his hand. "How many trips?" "If we get 4 aircraft, 3 trips each. 12 total." "I'm in," MC Clerg said. Captain Edwin Olander volunteered. "I'll fly." Lieutenant Junior Grade William Case volunteered. "Count me in." 4 pilots. 4 Corsairs. 4 simultaneous landings could reduce ground time. Load all 4 aircraft at once. Take off together. Japanese artillery would have multiple targets. Harder to hit. The plan solidified. 4 modified Corsairs. Depart Villa La Villa at 10:45.
Arrive Torokina at 11:10. Land, load 3 wounded per aircraft. Depart by 11:25. Fly to Guadalcanal, offload. Return to Torokina for second load. 3 trips total.
Boyington briefed the other pilots. "We'll land in finger 4 formation. 30-second intervals spread across the strip. That disperses Japanese artillery targeting. Ground time maximum 10 minutes. The wounded will be on litters at the strip edge. Corpsmen will load them into our aircraft. We just need to keep engines running and be ready to taxi immediately after loading." The pilots nodded. They understood the risk. Landing under artillery fire violated every safety protocol, but 32 wounded Marines needed evacuation. Nobody questioned the mission. By 10:35, 4 Corsairs sat on the Villa La Vella flight line with their AFT fuselages gutted. Radio equipment removed. Fuel tanks pulled. Access panels secured with speed tape instead of proper fasteners. The modifications weren't pretty, but they'd hold for a 90-minute flight. Boyington strapped into aircraft 86. He ran through pre-flight checks. Magnetos good. Oil pressure good. Fuel quantity good. He had 180 gallons. Enough for 3 hours of flight at cruise power. Plenty of margin. He fired up the R2800 engine. The 18-cylinder radio roared to life. Smoke blasted from the exhaust stacks. The propeller bit into the humid air. He checked control movement. Stick, rudder, throttle, mixture. Everything functioned normally. At 10:43, all 4 Corsairs were running. Boyington released brakes and taxied. The other 3 followed in trail. They took off at 10:46. The flight to Torokina took 24 minutes. Boyington led the formation at 8,000 feet. Altitude gave them standoff from Japanese anti-aircraft fire and better visibility of the airstrip. At 11:09, Torokina appeared ahead. Boyington could see smoke rising from multiple points around the perimeter. Artillery impacts. The fighting was close. He keyed his radio. Torokina Tower, Black Sheep Flight of 4 requesting landing clearance for wounded evacuation. The tower responded immediately. Black Sheep, cleared to land. Be advised, strip is under sporadic artillery fire. Last impact 6 minutes ago at the east end. Recommend expedited approach. Boyington acknowledged. He turned to the other pilots on the tactical frequency. Here's how we'll do this. I'll land first. Taxi to the west revetment area. Ashmun, you follow 30 seconds behind. Taxi to midstrip. Olander, your third east revetment. McClurg, your tail. Park at the threshold. That spreads us across 2,000 feet. Harder to hit all of us with one barrage. The pilots confirmed. Boyington rolled into his approach. The Corsair's long nose blocked his forward view. He S-turned on final to see the runway. At 200 feet, he straightened out. The coral strip rushed up. He pulled power. The Corsair settled. Main gear touched at 90 miles per hour. Tail wheel came down. He stood on the brakes. The aircraft decelerated hard. He turned off at the first taxiway and headed for the west revetment. Behind him, Ashmun's Corsair touched down, then Olander's, then MC Clerg's. 4 fighters on the ground simultaneously. Boyington reached the revetment at 11:13. A Navy corpsman ran toward his aircraft waving his arms. Behind the corpsman, 8 Marines on stretchers lay in the mud. Boyington kept the engine running. He couldn't shut down. Restarting would take 2 minutes they didn't have. The corpsman climbed onto the wing. He shouted over the engine noise. "Major, we've got the worst cases loaded for us. 2 men ready for your aircraft." Boyington gave a thumbs up. He watched 2 corpsmen lift a litter and carry it toward the Corsair. The wounded Marine on the litter was unconscious. Bandages covered his chest and left arm. Blood had soaked through. They positioned the litter next to the aft fuselage access panel. The corpsman looked at the 18-inch opening and then at the 6-foot-long Marine on the litter. "He won't fit, sir," one corpsman yelled. Boyington climbed out of the cockpit. He measured the opening with his eyes. The Marine was 6 feet tall, maybe 180 pounds, too big to fit straight in. "Angle him diagonal, feet first, head toward the tail."
The corpsman tried. They lifted the Marine off the litter and attempted to slide him into the fuselage opening feet first. His shoulders caught on the frame. They couldn't get him past the opening.
Boyington grabbed the wounded Marine's shoulders. On 3, push hard. The corpsman pushed. Boyington pulled. The Marine's body scraped through the opening. He slid into the aft fuselage. Not comfortable, definitely not safe, but inside. The second wounded Marine was smaller, 5'8", maybe 150 pounds. He was conscious, shrapnel wounds in both legs. The corpsman slid him in easier. He lay on top of the first Marine, head to toe. 2 men in the aft fuselage, 1 more in the cockpit. The corpsman brought a 3rd litter. This Marine was conscious, stomach wound, plasma bag attached to his arm. They lifted him to the wing. Boyington helped him into the cockpit. The Marine sat on the seat facing forward. Boyington climbed in behind him. He sat on the seat back edge with the wounded Marine between his legs. His chest pressed against the Marine's back. He could barely see over the Marine's shoulder, but he could see enough. Instruments were mostly blocked, but he could see the windscreen and side windows. Enough to fly visually. He signaled the corpsman to close the canopy. They slid it forward and locked it. The cockpit was cramped. 3 men in a space designed for 1. Boyington could barely move. His left arm reached around the wounded Marine to the throttle. His right hand rested on the control stick. His feet operated the rudder pedals. The wounded Marine's head blocked 60% of his forward view. Boyington checked his watch, 11:18. 5 minutes on the ground. He needed to go. He added power. The Corsair rolled forward. Taxiing was difficult. He couldn't see directly ahead. He navigated by looking out the side windows and making constant corrections. At 11:21, he reached the runway threshold. Ashman's Corsair was already lined up. Olander and McClurg were taxiing into position. Boyington keyed the radio. Black Sheep laid ready for takeoff. Black Sheep 2 ready, 3 ready, 4 ready. Boyington released brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The R2800 engine roared to full power. 2,000 horsepower drove the propeller. The Corsair accelerated. Boyington couldn't see the center line. He steered by peripheral vision, watching the runway edge out the side windows. At 80 miles per hour, he felt the tail come up. At 90 miles per hour, he pulled back on the stick. The Corsair lifted off. He was airborne with 1,200 feet of runway remaining. He climbed straight ahead, didn't turn until reaching 500 feet. Behind him, the other 3 Corsairs took off in 30-second intervals. By 11:25, all 4 aircraft were climbing southbound toward Guadalcanal. Inside Boyington's cockpit, the wounded Marine was barely conscious. His head lolled against Boyington's chest. His breathing was shallow. Boyington could feel the Marine's back pressed against him, could feel each breath. In the aft fuselage, the other 2 wounded were invisible. Boyington had no way to check on them, no way to know if they were alive or dead. He just flew. The flight to Guadalcanal took 52 minutes. Boyington maintained 8,000 feet, cruise power, 190 miles per hour. He didn't push the engine. The Corsair was carrying 570 pounds of extra weight. 3 wounded Marines. The aircraft handled differently. Slower to respond. heavier in pitch, but controllable. At 12:17, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal appeared ahead. Boyington called the tower. Henderson, Black Sheep Flight of 4 requesting priority landing. Medical evacuation. Black Sheep cleared direct to Field Hospital parking area. Ambulances standing by. Boyington landed at 12:22. He taxied to the hospital area where 4 ambulances waited. Corpsman ran toward his aircraft before he shut down the engine. They climbed onto the wing, opened the canopy, helped the wounded Marine out of the cockpit. Then they opened the aft fuselage panel and pulled out the other 2 Marines. All 3 were alive, barely, but alive. The corpsman loaded them into ambulances and drove toward the hospital building. Boyington didn't watch. He refueled his Corsair and prepared for the second trip.
Ashmun, Olander, and Mac Clerg landed within 3 minutes. 9 wounded Marines evacuated.
23 remaining at Torokina. At 12:50, the 4 Corsairs took off again. Same formation. Same plan. Load 3 wounded per aircraft. Get them to Henderson Field. Repeat. The second trip went faster. The corpsman at Torokina had figured out the loading process. Angle wounded diagonal, feet first into the fuselage. Smaller Marines in the cockpit. Larger Marines in the aft fuselage. By 13:35, Boyington was landing at Henderson with 3 more wounded. 18 total evacuated, 14 remaining. The third trip launched at 14:05. Boyington was exhausted. He'd flown 6 hours of combat missions in the past 9 hours. His shoulders ached from holding the Corsair steady with a wounded Marine sitting against him. His legs cramped from operating rudder pedals in the confined space. But he had 14 Marines left at Torokina. He flew north again. At 14:48, Boyington landed at Torokina for the 3rd time. Japanese artillery had intensified. Shells were landing every 4 minutes. The base commander met Boyington at the revetment. "Major, we need to expedite this. They've got the strip ranged. Next barrage hits in 3 minutes." Boyington nodded. "Load fast." The corpsmen worked with desperate speed. They had the technique perfected now. 2 minutes per aircraft. 14 wounded remaining. 4 aircraft. 3 per aircraft equals 12. 2 would have to wait for a 4th trip. But Boyington made a decision. "Load 4 in mine. I'll take 1 extra." "Sir, you're already overweight." "I'll manage. Load them." The corpsman loaded 4 wounded Marines into Boyington's Corsair. 2 in the aft fuselage as before. 1 in the cockpit sitting forward. 1 sitting on the cockpit floor between Boyington's legs and the instrument panel. The 4th Marine was crammed into a space that didn't exist. His head pressed against the lower instrument panel. His legs folded beneath him. Boyington's forward visibility was now 0. He couldn't see ahead at all, just side windows. He'd have to taxi and take off by looking out the side. At 14:56, Boyington added power. The Corsair didn't move. The weight was too much. He added more power. The wheels broke free from the mud. The aircraft rolled forward, sluggish, heavy. He couldn't see where he was going. He navigated purely by peripheral vision. Watching the revetment walls slide past his side windows, watching other parked aircraft to judge his distance. At the runway threshold, he lined up by guessing. He pushed the throttle to full power. The Corsair accelerated slowly, very slowly. At 60 miles per hour, it should have been lifting the tail. The tail stayed down. At 70 miles per hour, still tail down. At 80 miles per hour, the tail finally came up. He was running out of runway. Torokina's strip was 3,800 feet. He'd used 2,000 feet and wasn't airborne yet. At 90 miles per hour, he pulled back. The Corsair didn't respond. Too heavy, too slow, he held back pressure. At 95 miles per hour, he felt the main gear lighten. At 100 miles per hour, the aircraft staggered into the air. He was 200 feet from the end of the runway. He cleared the tree line by 30 feet. The Corsair climbed at 400 feet per minute. Normal climb rate was 3,120 feet per minute. He was operating at 13% of normal performance. The aircraft was dangerously overloaded, but he was airborne. Behind him, the other 3 Corsairs took off successfully. 14 wounded Marines total on this trip. 32 evacuated overall. Mission complete. Boyington flew to Henderson Field at 6,000 feet. He didn't have the power to climb higher. The flight took 58 minutes. He landed at 16:04. Corpsman unloaded 4 wounded Marines from his aircraft. All 4 were alive. 32 wounded Marines evacuated from Torokina in 6 hours. 0 casualties during evacuation. 0 aircraft lost. The mission was a complete success. But Boyington's Corsair was damaged. The aft fuselage showed stress cracks around the access panel from the weight of the wounded Marines. The landing gear showed excessive wear from the overweight takeoffs. The engine had been run at high power settings for extended periods while overloaded. Maintenance estimated 40 hours of repair work before the aircraft would be combat ready again. Boyington didn't care. The aircraft could be repaired. Dead Marines couldn't. That night at Henderson Field, the senior medical officer found Boyington in the VMF 214 tent area. Captain Harold Sanders, Navy doctor, 15 years of service. He wanted to talk about the wounded Marines. Sanders explained that 8 of the 32 evacuated men would have died within 24 hours without surgery. Their wounds were too severe for field hospital treatment. 4 others would have lost limbs to infection. Getting them to Henderson Field surgical facilities saved their lives and their futures. You saved 32 men today, Major, Sanders said. Some people might say you violated regulations and endangered lives with an unauthorized aircraft modification. I did violate regulations, Boyington said, and I'd do it again. The story of Boyington's jungle strip evacuation spread through marine aviation channels within 48 hours. By December 18th, every fighter squadron in the Solomon Islands knew about it. Pilots discussed the technique. Could other fighters be modified for casualty evacuation? Could the concept be standardized? Marine Corps headquarters on Guadalcanal initiated a formal inquiry, not to punish Boyington, to evaluate whether his improvised technique should become doctrine. A board of 3 officers interviewed Boyington on December 21st. They wanted details. Aircraft modifications, weight calculations, loading procedures, flight characteristics with passengers. Boyington provided complete information. He emphasized the risks, the overweight takeoffs, the limited visibility, the stress on the airframe. He recommended against making it standard procedure. Too dangerous. Too many variables. The board disagreed. They saw potential. In jungle warfare, casualties often occurred at remote locations with no transport aircraft access. Fighter strips could handle Corsairs where C-47s couldn't land. Having the capability to evacuate wounded using fighters could save lives across the theater. The board made recommendations. First, develop standardized modifications for the F4U Corsair to carry casualties. Removable panels instead of permanent removal.
Second, train select pilots in overweight operations and limited visibility flying.
Not all pilots, just volunteers with appropriate experience. Third, establish procedures for emergency medical evacuation using fighters when transport aircraft were unavailable. By January 1944, the Marine Corps issued Technical Bulletin 44-12, Emergency Casualty Evacuation using F4U Corsair aircraft. The bulletin described Boyington's technique in detail. It included weight calculations, loading diagrams, flight procedures. It authorized squadron commanders to modify Corsairs for casualty evacuation when tactical situations required. The bulletin noted that such operations were high risk and should only be attempted by experienced pilots under emergency conditions.
Several Marine squadrons immediately implemented the modifications. VMF 215, VMF 221, VMF 223.
They practiced loading wounded into modified Corsairs. They conducted training flights with simulated casualties. By March, 15 Marine fighter squadrons had at least 2 aircraft configured for emergency evacuation. The capability was used 6 times between February and August 1944. Marine pilots evacuated wounded from Emerald, Green Island, Palilu, and other remote locations where transport aircraft couldn't operate. The modified Corsair technique saved an estimated 47 additional lives during that period, but the technique had limitations. It required experienced pilots with exceptional flying skills. It stressed aircraft beyond design specification. It was dangerous under the best conditions and potentially fatal under combat conditions. The Marine Corps never made it standard doctrine. It remained an emergency capability, authorized but not encouraged. After the war, military historians studied Boyington's evacuation mission. The U.S. Naval Institute published an analysis in 1948. The report concluded that Boyington's innovation demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility and pilot initiative.
The report noted that strict adherence to regulations and aircraft operating limitations would have resulted in 32 preventable deaths.
The innovation wasn't just the aircraft modification. It was the willingness to attempt something unprecedented under extreme pressure. The report recommended that future pilot training emphasize creative problem-solving and adaptation over rigid procedural compliance. Modern military medical evacuation doctrine traces some of its principles to Boyington's Torokina mission. The concept of using non-traditional assets for casualty evacuation. The idea that any aircraft can become a medevac platform if the situation demands it. These principles appear in current Army and Marine Corps field manuals. Gregory Boyington didn't survive the war unscathed. On January 3, 1944, 19 days after the Torokina evacuation, he was shot down during a mission over a ball. His Corsair was hit by Japanese Zero fighters. He bailed out over the ocean. Japanese forces captured him. He spent 20 months as a prisoner of war, beaten, starved, interrogated. He survived through willpower and the same refusal to quit that had defined his entire career. Liberation came in August 1945, when Allied forces reached his POW camp near Tokyo. Boyington weighed 110 pounds. He'd lost 70 pounds during captivity. But he was alive. The Marine Corps promoted him to lieutenant colonel and awarded him the Medal of Honor for his combat record. 28 confirmed kills, 14 damaged. Leadership of VMF 214 through the most intense air combat of the Pacific War. The Medal of Honor citation mentioned his aggressive tactics, his inspirational leadership, his willingness to place himself in extreme danger. It didn't mention Torokina or the 32 wounded Marines he evacuated. That mission wasn't officially recognized because it violated too many regulations to celebrate publicly. But the pilots who flew with him remembered. The Marines he saved remembered. The corpsmen who loaded wounded into impossibly small spaces remembered. After the war, Boyington struggled. Post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, failed marriages. He drank heavily for years, worked various jobs, wrestling referee, beer salesman. He published his autobiography, Baba Black Sheep, in 1958. The book was successful. It portrayed him as a flawed hero, a brilliant pilot who couldn't function in peacetime, a warrior without a war. Television discovered him in the 1970s. A network produced a series based on his life. The show ran for 2 seasons, made Boyington famous again, but never mentioned Torokina, never showed the desperate improvisation or wounded Marines crammed into impossible spaces. In 1983, a former Navy corpsman approached Boyington at a Marine reunion. He'd helped load wounded into Boyington's Corsair that day. He introduced 2 Marines who'd been evacuated on that flight. Both had survived surgery, completed recovery, served additional tours. "We're alive because you broke regulations, sir," one said. Boyington didn't trust his voice. Later, he told a friend that meeting them meant more than the Medal of Honor. The medal recognized kills. The reunion recognized lives saved. Gregory Boyington died on January 11, 1988, age 75. The Marine Corps buried him at Arlington with full honors. The ceremony honored his 28 kills and Medal of Honor. It didn't mention Torokina, but former VMF 214 members published their own memorial listing his accomplishments, including one final entry.
December 15, 1943. Major Boyington evacuated 32 wounded Marines from Torokina under artillery fire. All survived.
Mission not officially recognized. That was his real legacy. The willingness to break regulations when lives depended on it. The refusal to let Marines die when an option existed, no matter how dangerous. One pilot, one modified fighter, 32 wounded Marines. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for making sure Gregory Boyington doesn't disappear into silence.